There are stories in history that feel almost impossible to believe. The tale of the P-39 Airacobra is one of them. In America, it was doubted. In Britain, it was dismissed. Pilots complained about its heavy frame, its lack of high-altitude power, and its awkward design. To many in the West, the Airacobra was a failed experiment, a fighter that never lived up to its promise. And yet, on the other side of the world, this very same machine was flying into legend. In the hands of Soviet pilots, the P-39 became a weapon of survival and victory. Its low-altitude power, its 37mm cannon, and its rugged build turned it into a deadly force on the Eastern Front. What one nation cast aside, another embraced as a lifeline in their darkest battles. This contradiction makes the Airacobra more than just another World War II aircraft. It is a reminder of how perspective, strategy, and necessity can shape the destiny of a machine, and the men who flew it. If you've ever wanted to uncover the hidden, unexpected stories of the war, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because today we dive into the incredible saga of the P-39 Airacobra, the fighter America doubted, but Russia loved. By the late 1930s, the world was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Europe was sliding into chaos. The Luftwaffe was expanding at a frightening pace, and the United States knew it could no longer remain on the sidelines of aviation progress. American designers were under pressure to produce something bold, something that could stand against the machines tearing across the skies of Europe. It was in this atmosphere of urgency that the idea for the P-39 Airacobra was born. Bell Aircraft, still a young company, set out to create a fighter unlike any that had come before. Instead of sticking to the conventional formula, they dared to experiment. They placed the engine not in the nose but behind the pilot, driving the propeller through a long shaft. This unusual layout opened the way for a powerful new weapon, a 37mm cannon mounted directly in the nose. On paper, it was a revolutionary concept, a fighter that could punch holes through bombers and even armored targets, giving America an edge it desperately wanted. For a moment, optimism ran high. Military planners looked at the Airacobra's specifications and imagined a future where this radical design would give the United States a unique advantage. The P-39 seemed to embody a new philosophy, that air power wasn't only about speed and altitude, but also about striking force and survivability. It was the kind of thinking that made sense in a time when no one knew exactly how the next war would be fought. But as history would soon reveal, innovation often walks hand in hand with risk. The very features that made the Airacobra so bold would also become the source of its greatest struggles. And yet, this is precisely what makes its story unforgettable. Stay with us, because the next chapter shows how this daring design collided with the harsh realities of combat. The Airacobra was nothing if not unconventional. From the very first glance, it looked different from almost every other fighter of its time. Instead of the engine sitting proudly in the nose, Bell Aircraft's designers tucked the Allison V-1710 behind the cockpit, connected to the propeller by a long drive shaft running under the pilot's feet. This odd placement allowed engineers to clear space in the nose for a weapon that was unheard of in a single-engine fighter, a 37mm cannon capable of tearing through bombers and even light armor. On paper, it sounded like a stroke of genius. In reality, it was a gamble. The cockpit itself was equally unusual. Pilots climbed in through side doors that opened like those of a car, giving the Airacobra a strange, almost civilian feel compared to the sliding canopies of other fighters. Once inside, They sat in a spacious cockpit with better visibility than many of their contemporaries. But the comfort didn't erase the nagging questions about the aircraft's performance. And this is where the Airacobra began to stumble. To save weight and simplify the design, Bell removed the turbo supercharger that many high-performance fighters relied on. This decision crippled the P-39 at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, where much of the air war over Europe was fought, the Airacobra struggled badly. It lacked the climb rate and top speed to match Messerschmitts or Spitfires, and in the unforgiving world of aerial combat, those weaknesses could mean the difference between life and death. For American and British pilots expecting a nimble, high-flying escort fighter, disappointment set in quickly. Reports described it as sluggish at altitude, better suited for low-level work than the kind of missions the Allies desperately needed. A machine that had once been hailed as revolutionary was now whispered about as a failure. And yet, the irony of the Airacobra's design was that what seemed like its fatal flaw in one theater would turn into an unlikely advantage in another. Before we dismiss it as a lost cause, we need to see how a different battlefield and a different philosophy of war would transform the Airacobra's destiny. Stay with us, because the next chapter reveals how the P-39, scorned in the West, became a beloved weapon in the East. What the West dismissed, the Soviet Union embraced. When the United States sent hundreds and eventually thousands of P-39 Airacobras eastward through the Lend-Lease program, few in Washington thought they were giving away a prize. To many American officers, the Airacobra was little more than an experiment gone wrong, a second-rate fighter not suited for the war over Europe. But on the Eastern Front, where the fighting was brutal and often fought just above the treetops, the Airacobra found its true purpose. The very weakness that crippled the P-39 in Western eyes, its lack of a turbo supercharger, barely mattered in Russia. Most air battles on the Eastern Front were fought at low or medium altitudes, often below 15,000 feet. Here, the Allison engine delivered steady power, and the Airacobra could fight on equal terms. It wasn't about soaring at 30,000 feet. It was about clawing for survival just above the trenches, rail yards, and tank columns where the war was decided. And then there was the cannon. That 37mm gun, mocked as impractical in American service, became a game-changer for Soviet pilots. With one or two accurate bursts, a German bomber could be torn apart. A single round could rip through a Stuka dive bomber or punch into the armor of a Panzer. Soviet flyers, hardened by necessity, learned to fire sparingly, using that small ammunition load with deadly precision. For them, the Airacobra wasn't just another fighter. It was a scalpel, a weapon of choice in the close, savage skies over the front lines. Names like Aleksandr Pokryshkin and Grigori Rechkalov became legendary, both of them flying Airacobras to dozens of victories. Pokryshkin, in particular, one of the greatest aces of the war, devised new tactics that perfectly suited the P-39's strengths. He used vertical maneuvers and sharp dives to unleash its cannon at the perfect moment, proving to his comrades that this discarded fighter could bring down the best of the Luftwaffe. For Soviet propaganda, the Airacobra became a symbol of Allied support. But for the men in the cockpit, it was more personal. It was a tool that kept them alive and gave them a fighting chance against a formidable enemy. Pilots on the ground began to trust the machine, even love it. They spoke of its ruggedness, its steady handling, and the confidence it inspired once you learned how to master its quirks. For young Soviet flyers with only a handful of combat hours before being thrown into battle, the Airacobra was forgiving enough to keep them alive long enough to learn, and lethal enough to let them strike back. So while the West shook its head, the East quietly built a legend. What one nation dismissed as a disappointment, another transformed into a cornerstone of its air defense. And this is the paradox that makes the Airacobra unforgettable. If you find it remarkable that a failed American design could become a Soviet hero, share your thoughts below, because history is often stranger and far more inspiring than we first imagine. Now, to fully grasp this contrast, we need to look back at how America and Britain viewed the very same machine. While the Soviet Union was discovering the Airacobra's hidden strengths, America and Britain were turning away from it with disappointment. In the skies over Western Europe, where battles unfolded at high altitude against Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, the P-39 simply could not compete. The decision to remove the turbo supercharger had crippled its ability to climb and perform above 15,000 feet, and in that environment, the Airacobra was often outclassed before the fight had even begun. The Royal Air Force tested the aircraft early in the war, hoping it might fill a gap in their fighter squadrons. Instead, British pilots quickly reported its weaknesses: sluggish at altitude, poor acceleration in vertical combat, and an engine that left them exposed against the Luftwaffe's best. Their conclusion was blunt: they didn't want it. The Airacobra was quietly retired from British service almost as quickly as it arrived. In the United States, the reaction was little better. American pilots longed for machines that could protect bombers deep into enemy territory or challenge German fighters head-on at high altitude. The P-39 simply wasn't that machine. It ended up relegated to secondary roles: training missions, air defense in quieter theaters, or service in remote regions like Alaska and the South Pacific. To many American flyers, it was a disappointment, a reminder of what might have been had its design fulfilled its original promise. This sharp contrast with the Soviet experience only deepens the Airacobra's paradox. One nation dismissed it as unworthy, another turned it into a symbol of survival. And that contradiction is what makes the story of the P-39 so compelling. If you're struck by how perspective can change everything in war, stay with us, because the next part brings you face to face with the pilots whose stories made the Airacobra unforgettable. What truly brings the story of the Airacobra to life are the men who flew it. Statistics can tell us how many aircraft were built or how many missions were flown, but the human stories reveal why this controversial fighter mattered at all. In the hands of different pilots, the P-39 became either a burden or a blessing, a machine cursed in some skies and cherished in others. For Soviet ace Aleksandr Pokryshkin, the Airacobra was nothing short of transformative. He flew the P-39 to dozens of victories and crafted innovative tactics that maximized its strengths. Instead of trying to fight the Luftwaffe on their terms, Pokryshkin used vertical maneuvers, diving strikes, and precise bursts from the 37mm cannon. In his hands, the Airacobra became a scalpel, and his leadership inspired countless younger pilots. To him, the aircraft was not a flawed design. It was a loyal partner that helped turn the tide. Stories from American pilots, however, often carried a very different tone. Many described frustration with the Airacobra's lack of high-altitude performance and its vulnerability in theaters dominated by fast, agile opponents. Some even dreaded being assigned to fly it, calling it an aircraft that demanded compromises in fights where seconds could mean survival. For them, the cannon that the Soviets praised felt clumsy, inaccurate, and too limited in ammunition. And yet, both perspectives highlight the same truth. The Airacobra was never an easy machine to master. Those who learned its quirks and accepted its limits could achieve remarkable things. Those who expected it to perform like a Spitfire or Mustang were bound to be disappointed. The difference lay not just in the aircraft, but in the environment, the tactics, and the mindset of the men in the cockpit. These gunnery duels, survival stories, and contrasting memories remind us that history isn't black and white. One man's failure was another man's salvation. And it is in these contradictions that the Airacobra earned its place in the history of aviation. If you find these stories as haunting and inspiring as the machine itself, let us know in the comments, because remembering these voices is just as important as remembering the aircraft they flew. Next, we'll step back and look at the limits and attempted improvements of the P-39, a chapter that explains why this paradoxical fighter remained both admired and forgotten at the same time. For all its unusual qualities, the Airacobra could never escape the weight of its limitations. The absence of a turbo supercharger left it crippled at high altitude, unable to keep pace with the demands of the air war over Europe. American and British pilots wanted a machine that could climb with a Spitfire or escort bombers deep into hostile skies. But the P-39 simply wasn't that fighter. It had been designed with promise, yet it carried within it the seeds of its own frustration. Bell Aircraft tried to address these shortcomings. The P-400, a version originally intended for Britain, carried different armament, but offered little improvement in overall performance. Other variants experimented with upgraded engines and equipment, but none of them truly solved the fundamental problem. The Airacobra had been built around a bold idea that did not match the needs of its original users. In the Pacific, it saw some service against the Japanese, and in training fields across America, it taught young pilots the basics of combat flying. Yet its true glory remained confined to the Eastern Front, where the conditions made sense of its design. In many ways, the Airacobra became a symbol of both daring innovation and missed opportunity. It showed what could be achieved with bold thinking, but also how dangerous it was to strip away a vital element, like the turbocharger, in pursuit of practicality. And yet, despite these flaws, it still wrote a remarkable story in the hands of those who refused to give up on it. Understanding these limits is essential before we look at its legacy, because the Airacobra's final chapter is not about weakness or failure. It is about how one machine, so often doubted, still carved out a place in history. Stay with us, because the story of its legacy is one of the most surprising of the entire war. The legacy of the P-39 Airacobra is not a simple one. In the United States and Britain, it is remembered, if at all, as a flawed experiment, a fighter that fell short of expectations and was quickly overshadowed by more capable designs. For many Western pilots, it symbolized the risks of chasing innovation without fully considering the realities of combat. It was the aircraft they tolerated rather than trusted, a machine consigned to training fields and secondary fronts. But in the Soviet Union, the very same aircraft became something entirely different. There, it was not a failure, but a hero. Soviet aces carved their reputations in the Airacobra, proving that when matched with the right environment and the right tactics, the P-39 could be devastating. For pilots like Pokryshkin and Rechkalov, the jug-shaped machine was not just a tool of war, it was the key to survival and victory. They saw in it what others could not, a weapon perfectly suited to the brutal, low-altitude battles of the Eastern Front. This dual identity, dismissed in the West, revered in the East, is what makes the Airacobra's story so compelling. It reminds us that history is rarely absolute, and that the value of a machine lies not only in its design, but in the hands of those who use it. The P-39 did not conquer the skies everywhere, but where it mattered most, it changed lives and helped shape the outcome of the war. So when we remember the icons of World War II, let us not forget the Airacobra. Share your thoughts below if you believe that even flawed machines deserve their place in history, because the story of the P-39 is a story of perspective, resilience, and the strange paths of destiny.